I'm Spencer Bailey. This is Time Sensitive. Hey everyone, this week on the podcast, I'm joined in the studio by the German-born, New York-based architect Annabelle Selldorf, who's the principal of the firm Selldorf Architects, which she founded in 1988. Renowned for their work in the art world, from galleries for the likes of David Zwirner and Hauser & Wirth to cultural institutions including the Frick Collection, the National Gallery in London, and the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden in Washington, D.C., Selldorf's firm has also designed a variety of residential projects, as well as civic buildings such as a recycling facility in Brooklyn. Annabelle's breakthrough project was the Neue Gallery on Fifth Avenue, for which she completely renovated a 1914 Beaux-Arts mansion for the museum's 2001 opening. Her firm has flourished ever since. Annabelle is widely known for her quietly rigorous designs that are so thought through and considered as to somehow feel inevitable. So often in her work, the architect's hand disappears, and that's exactly the point. In many ways, she's a true artist architect, someone who astutely understands how to create spaces that literally serve the art that's to be presented and shown within their walls. Resulting from her exacting vision and rather neutral design sensibility, her deeply layered, highly tuned architecture carries a profound sense of subtlety. While carefully crafted, her buildings are quite the opposite of showy. On the episode, among many things, we discuss the links she sees between slow food and her architecture, why she views her buildings as portraits, and why she considers architecture the mother of all arts. Before we get into the episode, I'd first like to thank our Season 8 presenting sponsor, the Maison Van Cleef & Arpels, which this year is working with the American Museum of Natural History in New York to present the exhibition Garden of Green, exquisite jewelry by Van Cleef & Arpels at the museum's Mignone Hall of Gems and Minerals. On view through March 2024, Garden of Green showcases 44 creations from the French high jewelry house, 32 of which are on view in the U.S. for the first time. Creating a lush garden of jewelry, this impressive array of precious and ornamental green stones forms a dazzling journey that celebrates the beauty of gardens and nature. One area of the exhibition space highlights a diversity of greenstones. Another concentrates on particular materials such as jade, chrysoprase, and malachite. And a third displays a selection of majestic creations set with emeralds. You can learn more at www.amnh.org/exhibitions. That's www.amnh.org/exhibitions. And now, here's my conversation with Annabelle. Hi, Annabelle. Welcome to Time Sensitive.
Hey, Spencer. It's good to see you again.
I thought we'd start on the subject of slow food.
One of my favorite topics.
Not exactly slow food, but as you see it. I mean, you've said I'm the equivalent of slow food in architecture. An intriguing statement, and I was hoping maybe you'd share a little bit more about what slow food in architecture looks like as you see it.
Ultimately, it's about the resonance of the taste, right? Slow food, the whole idea is that it's not sensational, it's not vertical, it's not a one-liner. And I think the equivalent to that in architecture might be that you cannot capture all at once what is going on, but rather the experience of the architecture reveals itself over time and perhaps comes back in memory. And so that's the long and short of it.
And yeah, I mean, I think extending out of that a little bit, your architecture tends to be quiet, methodical, layered. doesn't call out for attention necessarily. And yet when you step into one of your spaces, at least this is how I myself have experienced it, is that you feel the great level of care that has gone into it. It doesn't show itself to you necessarily. You have to spend time in it. And I was hoping you might talk a bit about that, the iterative process of realizing your buildings, kind of what goes into them so that that feeling when I walk into your building, for example, where do you think that feeling comes from, and how does this sort of iterative process help realize that?
It's not wrong to say that it's the care that goes into it, but I sometimes find myself admiring how people come up with these exciting ideas, and I feel like I don't. And you know, it makes you sometimes insecure in a world where everything is experienced so fast and you move on to the next thing and then the next thing. So when I think about architecture, I probably start with all the constraints, with like, you can't do this, you can't do that. And most of the constraints, if they're real constraints, leave you with a morsel of food behind. And then there are all the constraints of things where I go like, no, I definitely can't do this, or nope, this is not in the cards. And then that leaves even less, right? So then you have to move forward and start thinking about, well, what do you do with the little that is left? And how can you make a full experience for those who are going to experience the building or the space or whatever it may be? And then you subject that to robust and critical thinking. And much of it has to do with how does it get built? What is it made of? How does it tie into other things? And sometimes you find that's just not enough. And you have to look in your head about what makes it special, different, resonant. How does it answer a particular question? It's a slow process to get the entire narrative together. When I had a conversation with Ian Wardropper, the director of the Frick, the other day, and I said, I feel badly because I present ideas to you with all conviction and you go like, okay, I understand, I support. And then a month later, I come back and say, it's actually a little different. And, you know, when I think about myself, I think I'm decisive, moving in one direction, straight from A to Z. But I know that that's not true. It's like going 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. And I think I drive other people a little crazy in the process. I try not to. I mean, logic propels me. But you have to look at everything from all sides.
There's also this component of listening to clients, listening to contractors. And on the client front, you've described some of your projects as portraits, which I find really fascinating. It seems like the way you work, there's this really intimate relationship you build with your clients. Could you speak to that?
Not all clients, but most clients know more about their project than you do when you start it, meaning than I do when I started. So it's interesting and important to find out what and why they want things or do things or what their need is. And the most straightforward way to say is you devise a program and bam, 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 you sort of understand who they are. But I think especially in the kinds of projects that I do that have to do with art, you have to really understand more about that. And the reason why I think about it as portraits is that still you are the one drawing it or making it. So if you, I don't know, look at the portraits that Lucian Freud did, they're not necessarily always flattering. I think mine are generally flattering, but they express something about the deeper nature of the project and of the client. So portraiture, I think, is not inaccurate. And if I were a writer, I think it would be very interesting to sort of reveal one by one what a person is all about rather than what they look like. And I think maybe that is sort of analogous to what I'm talking about.
Yeah, it's not unlike profile writing.
It's not unlike profile writing or podcasting, for that matter.
Yeah, let's hope this episode captures some of the real Annabelle. Another element, and sort of extending out of, you mentioned you create a lot of spaces for art. These are spaces that quite literally slow people down, and I think kind of encourage them to linger, to engage in the work that's on the walls. They're spaces at the service or in the service of the art. They're not taking away from the art, they're enhancing the art, which doesn't always happen in architecture. Could you talk a bit about this intersection of art and architecture and how that connects, just going back to my first question, how that connects back to the slow food idea?
Yeah, this is an interesting question, and one that one could answer in multiple ways. I love making spaces for art because it gets you into direct dialogue with the art, with light, with proportion. I think that when we look at art, you always also see the space surrounding it. And when you remember art, you remember that part as well. I mean, there are people who have this photographic memory and say, I saw that painting in so-and-so's house, when they see it then later in an auction house. I don't mean that so much. But the relationship between art and the space that it is exhibited in is very powerful. Moving forward, though, in making spaces for art, so many other things play a role, and it is the role of the viewer or the visitor that I think becomes more and more interesting, because in some ways it's easy to say, oh, I love doing this because I love art and I'm used to looking at art, I'm used to going to museums. I've done that all my life. Now, working with institutions, the questions become a little bit different. And the questions are more about, why does it matter to look at art? You know, what's the power of art and naturally the space, the container that it is in? What is the power of that for the people who enter it? And how do you address those people who need to get across the threshold? It's very easy to say we want everybody to come, right? Yeah, sure. Absolutely, everybody. I wish to share that with everybody. And I mean that sincerely. Having said that, it shouldn't be coercive. You shouldn't have to go. I don't know that you saw in the New York Times yesterday that in, I think, Alabama or some such place, they are in favor of cutting teaching of the humanities at the university because it's likely that somebody who studies anthropology doesn't want to stay in Alabama. Actually, I think it was Mississippi. But so, like, how do we prepare people to not be one-dimensional? I think looking at art is one of those ways, and being in spaces that inspire you is certainly just as important. So I'm not sure that I'm answering your question, but it is on my mind to figure out what comes first. You know, I don't want beautiful, calm spaces be my personal obsession, because it's not about that. It's about how do you create an environment where somebody who's never been in a museum or who is acutely sensitive to the sort of elitist top-down Western art hierarchy that of course I'm a part of, you know. So how do you think around that? How do you detect your own biases when you are making space? And biases, I think, are different from prejudices. How to be present in the process and not one-dimensional or not narcissistic and selfish is sort of what I'm thinking about these days.
I love this notion of making space because you literally do that as an architect, but it's also become a phrase, I think, culturally that we talk about, especially around inclusiveness and thinking about how do we make space for others.
Right. So it'll come as no surprise to you that I make a lot of right angles. And I was at a panel discussion, just as a visitor, at DIA a couple of years ago. And there were artists talking about space and how originally space was curvilinear. And I was totally fascinated by that because the otherness of that kind of space to the spaces that are second nature to me was not only striking, but more than anything, I thought, well, you're telling me that my space making is wrong. But what about if we could just say they can coexist? It's not about right or wrong. It's not about one way of doing things. And now we're working at the AGO, the Art Gallery of Ontario, and we're teamed with Two Rows, an Indigenous firm, and Diamond Schmidt. That collaboration is so interesting because, again, it goes about how do people experience space, and the Cartesian grid is clearly something that has left a threat behind. Might as well accept that. And might as well just go deeper into that and find a sort of more sensuous way of making things. And I don't find that a contradiction to how I think. But it's actually really interesting to sort of look back, look forward, and think, like, where am I going here?
Evolve, yeah. You've said that architecture is the mother of all arts. What do you mean by that?
Well, you grow up in the womb of your mother, and that's shelter, right? And shelter is a big part of who we are. The built environment is the rational way of talking about it. But at the end of the day, we surround ourselves with, when we're lucky, we have the choice to surround us with buildings and spaces that we like or that we respond to. But not everybody does. It's the mother of all arts because you can't escape the house, the shelter, everything. And I think proportion, dealing with light and structure, is instructive in every way and has always been that, no matter how far back you go.
Womb rhymes with room.
Ooh, ouch. Yeah, very good, very good. Let's leave it at that.
But also, back to the rounded architecture. The womb is a rounded space.
Oh, yeah,
so it's,
absolutely. I mean, I think
connected.
That's definitely true.
Well, there's also this notion of, just to stay on the subject of time, which this podcast tends to do, there's also the notion of aging well. And I wanted to ask...
Are you trying to tell me that I need to get a facelift?
There's the good Annabelle Selldorf humor coming through. Well, I did want to ask because, with both your buildings, there's this idea of them morphing over time, gaining a sort of patina or the notion of a space settling into itself. And also, as a human and architect and someone born on July 5th, 1960, I think this notion of aging well, aging gracefully, slowly across time, and kind of the durational sense of time in this conversation we haven't fully touched on. So I thought I'd ask you about that. Like, how do you think about the durational in your work, in your life?
I can't remember who I am quoting here, but somebody smart said, I'm conservative. And what that means, I like to conserve things. And if you like to conserve things, then you have context and references that can go very far back, but don't have to by necessity. But they are real things, and they are instructive. And I love building new buildings, don't get me wrong. But I'm interested in how building makes sense in the context of so many things already being built. And I'm preparing for a talk myself on something, and I realized that I grew up in post-war Germany, and Cologne, where I am from, was just about completely destroyed in the Second World War. And the rebuilding exercise was fast and hectic. For one, because people required shelter, but also so much guilt in that war was associated with, like, let's get that behind us rather than dwelling on the loss, the horror, and the sadness of it. And in some ways, I think I'm not a psychologist, but that is something that reverberates with me, is appreciating longevity that buildings, say, can provide, the memories they provide, and also the quality and the care with which you deal with these things. Again, I think this has many layers to it, having to do with respect for knowledge and proportion and quality and all of those good things, and not being so hell-bent on reinventing the wheel. Almost everything exists already one way or the other. But instead to sort of find the more subtle realignment and motivations to create things. So yeah, I'm really happy when a space, a building, a project that I've worked on looks better 10 years in than it did day one, because it bears testimony to people having used it and lived in it and have left another layer of personality, which is ultimately what happens, right? If a building is a container, it becomes alive as a result of the people using it.
You teed this up so perfectly. If we're kind of on this subject, I have to bring up the Sunset Park Material Recovery Facility, which was completed in 2013. So it is celebrating its 10-year anniversary as we speak, basically. Actually, yeah, I think it was Michael Kimmelman's review of that building that came out November 2013. So I think
is that right?
I think it was exactly 10 years ago.
That's great.
This
I have to write Michael a note.
This episode will come out December 2023. But how do you think about that project from a time perspective and this decade and the people who have been using it? I know that's a personal question.
Well, I was just going to say, there are multiple thoughts I have about that. For one, on a completely personal note, lucky me, still with the person who at the time ran the recycling facility as a general manager, and we lived together and have a dog together.
And he was your client. You weren't romantically involved, and it was, I guess, through the time on this project
which was a long time, because it took a long time. I think it took 4 years to build this project. But yeah, I think looking back, what's interesting is that in working on the recycling facility and the life that I have with Tom since then has made me so much more sensitive to environmental issues. Now, you'd have to be a near-dead person not to be sensitive to environmental issues these days, but I think about them in dialogue with Tom. And we're not just sort of bemoaning climate crisis, but because that is his field, thinking about how we can utilize materials differently, how we can make better workplaces for those people who work in recycling facilities. It's a sort of ongoing learning process. But my values that made Michael Kimmelman happy with his facility haven't changed at all. I mean, again, a lot of it has to do with repurposing materials, with having an access to nature. I mean, that site is spectacular, of course, was when we built it, and is even more so now that lots of the greenery has grown in. Making spaces for work, providing access and inclusion, quite literally, because kids go there and learn about materials and recycling. And I probably, prior to working on this project, didn't know how much that mattered to me. But then once you learn something, you become so much more conscious about it, and you learn to articulate and verbalize things that may have been, in your head or part of your practice or something. But as a result of verbalizing them, you can also prioritize them. And that, I think, is good. We've since then engaged in a number of, not recycling projects per se, but infrastructural projects.
Yeah, there are these combined sewer overflow, as they're called, CSO buildings, the CSO Red Hook and the CSO Owl's Head. Tell me about these. Are these an outgrowth of that Sunset Park project, or?
Well, in a way, I think what I realized is that designing those kinds of projects is a little bit different, right? The CSO projects in particular are not so much for a person living there, looking out of the window, needing, I don't know, so much daylight. They're essentially big spaces that are not inhabited.
For when the next Sandy hits, practically,
Exactly.
right? Yeah.
No, absolutely. But what's fascinating about them is they're nevertheless civil servants and as such contributors to the city. And in a way, both of these projects are more sculptural than answering strictly to utility. And actually, that's not really true, because the utility of these buildings essentially dictates the scale, and there are so many requirements of what they have to sustain. Maybe I'm contradicting myself, because they sort of design themselves a little bit until you enter. But I like the abstraction that's associated with doing those kinds of projects.
And creating beauty out of a space that I think normally we associate with ugliness.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right. For me, what's really satisfying, and I can't maybe speak very eloquently about it, is there are two facilities that do the same thing that look totally differently, one from the other. After the first one was designed and we got the go-ahead on the second one, the team said, well, we're going to use these materials and those materials. And I thought, it's like, wait a minute, it's a totally different place. Let's not do that. And I am always the one who says, I'm totally rational. I understand why I'm doing this. I cannot exactly say why I felt that in one version, the concrete facades are so much more appropriate than the terracotta facades on the other. And if I think about it long and hard enough, I'll come up with an explanation that sounds good. But that is, of course, always what happens. There is this intuitive aspect of form making that you can never quite forget, and certainly not explain.
Hey everyone, taking a quick break here to tell you a little bit about our Season 8 presenting sponsor, the Maison Van Cleef & Arpels, which this year is working with the American Museum of Natural History in New York to present the exhibition Garden of Green, exquisite jewelry by Van Cleef & Arpels at the museum's Mignone Hall of Gems and Minerals. On view through March 2024, Garden of Green showcases 44 creations from the French high jewelry house, 32 of which are on view in the U.S. for the first time. Creating a lush garden of jewelry, this impressive array of precious and ornamental green stones forms a dazzling journey that celebrates the beauty of gardens and nature. To learn more, visit www.amnh.org/exhibitions. That's www.amnh.org/exhibitions. And now, back to the episode. I feel like this is a natural segue into your Frick Institute and
Frick Collection
and National Gallery London projects. I sort of kid. It's jumping from waste to high art is quite a jump, but I'm curious to see the connection points you see between these sort of utilitarian projects. Not sort of, these utilitarian projects, and on the opposite side of the spectrum, your work for these institutions namely the Frick and the National Gallery in this context?
Well, I suspect that I am very lucky that I have the opportunity to have that kind of spectrum. And there's a lot in between, right? We're building these buildings for 2 trees at Domino, done a number of housing projects, do private residences, design furniture. The process is never identical, but it is always the same. And what I mean by that is that the specific focus on what you want to influence guides the project. So utility is always a big part of it, but utility is also something that you can define. If you rent an apartment, you have to make yourself at home in a space that somebody else designed. Whereas if you build your own house, you can say, I'm going to have the biggest closet the world has ever seen, and I don't need a kitchen. I don't know that that's even relevant in this thing. But it's not about high and low, but it is about rigor of getting to answers that you generate yourself, but also that others answer you. And bigger subject matters come into play with that. I don't just think environmentally for the recycling facility, but you think about longevity and utilizing materials that contribute in every project, and in these in particular. And what distinguishes the Frick from the National Gallery, of course, is that nobody has contributed to the Fricks in significant ways for about 100 years. And the last architect was John Russell Pope. I mean, not the last architect. There were, others who did various smaller things. But you're encountering Pope and Hastings and have to have the confidence to say, it's going to be okay. Somebody wrote about this project when sort of renderings were published first and said, Miss Selldorf is no John Russell Pope. At which point I looked in the mirror and I thought, that's true.
I don't look like that.
I don't look like that. But all kidding aside, these kinds of projects matter to a lot of people, and for very good reasons. Not everybody's going to love what we do, but I think I'll speak just about the Frick right now. The amount of thinking and care that has gone into maintaining what people love about the Frick and complementing it in such a way that the experience is better is really what this is about. And, not everybody likes my shirt, so not everybody's going to like every choice we've made. But I don't think that anybody could say that we were careless, that we weren't restrained in the way in which we dealt with the historic, if you can call it that, the historic fabric, and a very, very specific attitude to opening the building for more people and making the thresholds less egregious. We talked about that in the beginning. And, Beaux-Arts buildings are very, very difficult to open up. So what do? You somehow try and bring light. You somehow don't deny the discipline that was part of the original design. And you build on an idea of welcome
that sort of belies some of the very foundation of the building. I mean, it's a Fifth Avenue mansion.
Yeah, it's a Fifth Avenue mansion, but it was built with the idea of it becoming a museum from the get-go. And that's remarkable. This was 1913 to 1919 is when Henry Clay Frick died. His wife lived there until she died, and in 1935, with the help of some additional work that John Russell Pope did, it became a public institution and has been a very special one ever since. And I think about that a lot. It's like, why did you want to have a museum in the first place? Why did you think that people would care? Sometimes people think about the Frick that having access to the home of a very wealthy person. There's nothing wrong with being curious about that. For many people, though, it is also the exceptional quality of the works of art, paintings, decorative arts, sculpture, and the really very magnificent spaces. And so, you work in the vein of that. But welcome is a funny thing, isn't it? It's like you cannot design welcome. You have to mean it. And so much of it has to do with the encounter. So much of it has to do with the humanity that you encounter when you go to a place. Like you want somebody to rope you in and say, come on in. And is there an architectural expression that does that? I don't know. I think it begins with intention. And then that intention becomes manifest. If you think about contemporary architecture, only because it's big and transparent doesn't make it per se more welcoming, I don't think. I'd like to know what you think about that.
Well, it's a complicated and also beautiful sentiment to think about how do we structure or design welcome. It makes me think about that Apple store on Fifth Avenue, which literally was like taking a basement space and saying, come on in, and became one of the most trafficked stores in probably history. I mean,
yeah, that's totally interesting. You're absolutely right.
And it's a stairwell, and it's kind of, you can't see what's inside, but you can still sort of see what's inside. There's an elevator, so there's also the accessibility element, and you can see the elevator from the outside.
Well, I think I am paid at it first, right?
The Louvre.
Yeah. And I think that's a great example. Both of them very successful, right? Both of them sort of signifying desire or something like that. Yeah, that's a very good point. Again, intentionality is a big part of that, and is what is at the beginning. With a renovation of an existing building, it's a little bit more difficult. But I think that you'll see that there are elements that make the building so much more literally accessible, but also visually more accessible. And the idea really centered around the garden on 70th Street, that so many more people will be able to look at from within and therefore make life in the building more manifest. And I'm proud of that. I'm excited about that.
Hey everyone, taking another quick break here to quickly mention the Slowdown's new membership program. By signing up, you can gain access to our slate of new member-only newsletters, in-depth stories, immersive interviews, and curated recommendations. If you haven't already checked it out and want to learn more, or if you'd simply like to support this podcast and all that we do at the Slowdown, go to slowdown.tv/subscribe. That's slowdown.tv/subscribe. We're offering a 20% discount through the end of the year. At checkout, use the code HOLIDAY20. That's all caps, HOLIDAY20. And now, back to the episode. Let's go back in time to the 1960s and 70s in Cologne. I understand your father was an architect and your mom worked with him as an interior designer.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about this house or houses that you grew up in. I think it's interesting for me anyway, but also hopefully for the listeners to hear about these environments, because I saw a few pictures of them and they seem to be quite formative. Maybe in retrospect, less like how you were maybe thinking about it at the time that you were coming up in those spaces. But I'd love to hear what you think about it now in hindsight.
Well, I talked a little bit about post-war Germany, and my parents were definitely, that was their generation. You know, they were kids during the Second World War, and they experienced the destruction and the rebuilding of it. And my father didn't go to architecture school, but rather stepped into my grandmother's business, who started out as an opera singer and eventually became a sort of interior designer, tastemaker who had access to French fabrics post-war and made...
Who you never met, right?
Who, unfortunately, I never met.
But she sounds absolutely fascinating.
I think she must have been just an amazing person. And the photographs I remember of her were, she was looking very bright and strict and upright. But she also painted. And when I was a kid, we had tons of her drawings and paintings that were almost kind of these lopsided flower paintings. But anyway, my parents worked together after my father separated from the firm that he had inherited from his mother with his brother and his sister. His sister died, and my father and his brother didn't see eye to eye on a variety of things and sort of decided to go their separate ways. But like I said, my father didn't go to architecture school. He became a licensed architect as a result of having practiced. I don't know that that's even possible anymore, but at the time that was possible. And he knew how to work with materials. He learned how to draw and drew unbelievably well. I just loved watching him draw. Everybody used rapidographs, and he used a rapidograph like other people use a pencil or something. And I think that one of the things that I realize as I get older is that I think objects that you design are material, therefore have to be constructed. And the intelligence of construction of anything, a building, millwork, furniture, is super interesting. So to know the fine points of dimensions and how to put things together is something that I pay attention to, and that is something that I learned from my father very specifically. And very specifically, the conversation that you have with people who make things. The attitude that you have to tell somebody what you want, but you have to understand how it can be put together in order to have an elevated conversation with somebody who probably knows more than you do about how to make something. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I love talking to, I don't know, a woodworker who knows better how to do something than me. But that conversation becomes meaningless if I don't start it with an idea about how it's put together and why, because that eventually translates into something visual. And we have that much less now than we did in a slower, more modest time that was when I was a kid.
Yeah, and I know, we only have so much time, and I do want to touch on some important parts of your early years. You've mentioned that between 18 and 20 was sort of an awful period for you, quote unquote awful, that you were full of doubt and fear. You were rejected from these architecture schools twice. But in 1980, you arrive in New York, you get into Pratt Institute, and it seems like that became quite transformational. I should also say here that you never, at least earlier in your life growing up, you never thought of becoming an architect despite your dad's profession. So I guess this is sort of a roundabout way of asking how you view that trajectory to New York and through New York and the experience at Pratt, and maybe ultimately also to Italy, where you got your master's in Florence through Syracuse University.
Yeah, I'll be quick about that. First of all, I wasn't rejected. The thing is, in Germany, you had to have an average degree in order to be accepted at a university that this central system would deliver to you. Now, this also tells you that I wasn't a very good high school student. But twice in a row, my degree average was not good enough. I didn't think of it so much as rejection. Maybe I did at the time, but as a really lucky break, because I applied to architecture school not knowing whether I really wanted to do this, seeing that my father worked incredibly hard, that he had very eccentric clients who would call at all times of the day and night to complain about one thing or another. And I was very suspicious of having to fulfill this kind of service relationship. And because of all of these doubts, I wasn't so unhappy that I couldn't go to architecture school, but then I didn't know what else to do. Studying law or working in a bank, all things my father suggested to make me not have that service-oriented profession, which of course is, anyway. I think it became sort of more interesting to me to go into architecture when I did an internship on a construction site. And I really loved working with people. And it goes a little bit back to sort of working with tradesmen and craftsmen. But the recognition that everything is made by a person and that there is a kind of humanity to what you do made me more confident, made me feel less sort of, I don't know, math type of thing. So when, in a roundabout way, by the time that I didn't get a place at the university the second year, I thought I really do want to go to architecture school. And I had been to New York, and I think I probably more wanted to go to New York than go to architecture school, but there it is, and the two things coincided. And looking back, I really needed to leave. I really needed to be in a different environment to become, I suppose, who I am today. But the older you get, the more you remember how you relate to your early upbringing. But I so enjoy being myself and not, embedded in the family business or in the sort of ancestral fight.
Right. There's such a New Yorkness to you now. After your master's, you quite quickly went on to start your own firm, 1988. Without getting too deep into all the projects, I think it is worth mentioning that the second project you ever did was in the Seagram building. It was an office for Daimler-Benz, which
right.
to me just seems incredible. Also, given the fact that Mies van der Rohe was one of your tentpole architectural titans figures that has continued to influence you in your work. And what was that like to be able to create a structure within the structure of someone you so admired?
It was funny because it was a very lucky thing that an eccentric person who worked at Daimler-Benz thought, why not ask a young person? I think in some ways they thought that it was easy enough and they would just tell me to do this carpet and that thing, and I totally over-intellectualized everything. So there is that lucky beginning, and then the seriousness that you bring to the task, and the discovery that the Seagram building is a great and thoughtfully designed building. There wasn't a thing that wasn't one way or the other thought through. And probably not just by the architects, but the Seagram building represents a building culture that has to do with longevity, with sort of thinking about bigger things from everybody. And that is really remarkable. The solidity of the doors. I'm sure somebody else will say, no, they cut corners here and there. I don't think they did. But understanding that building and the thought that had gone into decisions that might at first glance not be completely obvious, like, the band of light around the facade, that would give the building an appearance of continuity, even though over the years people put different color fluorescence in those lights. No, it was a learning experience in the sense that the rigor of the design that really permeates everything that Mies did is incredibly rewarding, because it doesn't prevent you from free thinking, but it's this discipline and freedom. Discipline and freedom. I don't know that I'm saying this very well, but
no, it makes sense. I did want to also talk about the mid-90s, which was such a pivotal time for you. 1996 and 97 in particular, you had these two major events in your life happen. One was this sort of freak accident where you were injured, and in 1997, you were hired by Ronald Lauder to design the Neue Gallery, this beautiful museum that everyone who knows well now has enjoyed since its opening in 2001. Tell me about that time. I mean, how did overcoming your injury and then landing this job that really lit a fuse, I think, in so many ways for your practice?
Yeah, both of those things were very big events. My accident was, I broke both femurs and was in a hospital for a little while, and the consequences of the accident lasted for well over a year. It was a phenomenal experience in the sense of learning to accept the help of others and appreciating the love and friendship that so many people gave me. That was unbelievably humbling. And I think also really helped to get better and to, be motivated to sort of be back in action. Some people, of course, said, well, you were working too hard and driving too hard and, you got to stop. Maybe that's true. I don't know. Maybe karmic moments happen in one's life.
And accidents happen too.
No, accidents actually don't happen. Incidents happen.
Sure.
Safety is no accident.
This is true. There's actually a really good book on it.
Well, this is something I talk with Tom about, because in the recycling facility, making sure that there are no incidents is vitally important for their business, but obviously for the health of the workers in the first place. But the ripple effect that carelessness brings about is huge. Anyway, it's like if you go to Europe, you have to wear steel-toed boots and a helmet and security. Here, if you go to a small construction site, it's like, just
we'll look the other way.
Careful for the nails on the floor.
Right.
Anyway, that's not what we're talking about. The point was, I learned a huge amount from this accident, and the compassion and empathy I encountered, and realized, that was something that you have to cherish. So then fast forward a year later, I'm all fine and running
Physical
around
therapy,
like a man.
done.
And I went to see the Neue Galerie, and I thought, whoa, this is a real building. And to this day, I marvel at the confidence that Ronald Lauder and Renee Price had for somebody with no experience to do such a project. And the generosity that they brought to every aspect of the design. And it took longer than anybody wanted it to take, and it was full of anxiety for all of us, not knowing whether anybody would want to see German art.
Lo and behold.
It is really marvelous to see that. Right now there's this Max Beckmann show that is fantastic. But many of the things that we've talked about in the last hour are about the thoughtfulness, the quality, the consideration, the longevity, the resonance. All of it is something that you learn from and with others, and that you acquire. And if you value those things, they become part and parcel of yourself. And so, to this day, I sort of am totally grateful that not only did I have the opportunity, but the experience of doing this project and the encounter with the art and the witnessing how Ronald thinks about design is unbelievably sensitive and incredibly insightful and truly knowledgeable, and somebody who has a kind of appreciation of objects and of haptic things that's really remarkable. I feel like I was so lucky to get that, and that's a part of me now. Do you know?
I thought we'd end this interview on the subject of humor. maybe it's an unexpected way to end, but for me, who's known you as long as I have, I've always appreciated your sense of humor. Germans, let alone architects, are not known for their humor. And we've had kind of a serious conversation today. But in one interview I came across, you described your neutral sensibility as an architect as 50 Shades of Grey. I thought that was pretty funny.
Well, you should say add to it when I said that. It was immediately after that book, whatever that was called, 50 Shades of Grey.
Yeah, the E.L. James. Yeah. Where do you think your humor comes from? And how is it that you have found yourself both a rigorous, serious architect, but also someone who doesn't take herself too seriously?
It's nice of you to say that. I actually think that you're born with a sense of humor. And I am sorry for people who haven't inherited that gene, the humor gene. And contrary to common belief, humor, I think, is something that people have or they don't have, regardless of whether they're German or Swiss
or an architect.
Or an architect. But I also think that humor is something that you are allowed to develop. I think that my sense of humor became way more freed up, so to speak, once I lived in America, because other people are funny. And I won't say that people in Germany don't appreciate humor. No, that's not true. Like, people from Cologne have a very, very dry sense of humor. And occasionally people don't know whether I'm joking or whether I'm serious. And that gives me the greatest pleasure when they just can't tell. But it's that dryness, I think, that I've brought from where I'm from. And maybe in a way, sense of humor always kind of brings you back to being humble. And like you said, not take yourself too seriously.
Let's end there. Thanks, Annabelle.
Thank you. That was very nice of you. But I think it's true too. No? You have a sense of humor, and a good one.
Extra thanks to our Season 8 presenting sponsor, the Maison Van Cleef & Arpels. Van Cleef & Arpels' jewelry is characterized by a distinctive blend of poetry and refinement. With its iconic jewelry collections, it is an invitation to a timeless universe of beauty and harmony. You can discover more at vancleefarpels.com. That's VANCLEEFARPELS.com. And thank you for listening. You can find more episodes of Time Sensitive on our website, timesensitive.fm, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can follow us on Instagram at slowdown.tv. To join the Slowdown's new membership program, which provides access to subscriber-only newsletters, in-depth stories, immersive interviews, and curated recommendations, go to slowdown.tv/subscribe. That's slowdown.tv/subscribe. Our theme music was composed by Billy Martin. This episode was produced by Ramon Broza, Emily Jang, Emily McDonald, Mimi Hannon, Hazen Mayo, and Johnny Simon.